Carmen had taken the job at the old shipping warehouse to help pay her college tuition. It was an enormous, drafty place on the edge of town, surrounded by overgrown fields and remnants of railroad tracks that hadn't seen use in decades. The building stood like a relic of a forgotten era, with its tall, rust-streaked metal walls and cracked windows. During the day, the place was a hum of activity with workers loading and unloading freight. But at night, Carmen was the only one there. She was the night shift guard, tasked with keeping watch from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Her first few nights were quiet, almost too quiet. The only sounds she heard were the distant hum of the highway and the occasional groan of the warehouse settling as the cool night air pressed in. But on her fourth night, things took a strange turn. As she made her routine rounds, her flashlight cut through the pitch black, revealing rows upon rows of towering shelves filled with boxes and crates. The beam landed on a flicker of movement, a shadow darting between the aisles. Carmen's heart skipped a beat. She stood still, trying to convince herself that her eyes were playing tricks on her. But then she heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. "Who's there?" she called out, trying to sound more confident than she felt. The only response was the whisper growing louder, as if dozens of voices were speaking all at once just beyond her line of sight. Panic rose in her chest. She tightened her grip on the flashlight and took a step back, scanning the dark space for any sign of life. But there was nothing, only the suffocating silence that followed the whispers, as if the entire warehouse was waiting, watching. Just as she was about to radio for backup, the temperature dropped sharply. Her breath came out in visible puffs, and goosebumps prickled her arms. Then, a loud crash echoed from the far end of the building. One of the metal crates had fallen, spilling its contents across the floor. Carmen jumped, the sound reverberating through her bones. She forced herself to move to check what had caused it, even as every instinct screamed for her to run. When she reached the overturned crate, there was no sign of anyone. But the contents, old, forgotten shipping manifests, were strewn across the floor, the papers fluttering as if an invisible hand was turning them. She felt a chill run down her spine. This job was going to be more than she'd bargained for. The whispers became a nightly occurrence. Their disembodied voices weaving through the silence like a cold wind. Carmen would walk her rounds, her footsteps echoing across the cavernous space, only to be met with the soft, insidious murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The worst part was that she could almost make out words, half-formed phrases that slipped away the moment she tried to focus on them. One night, she decided to record the sounds. She brought an old tape recorder and hid it in the pocket of her jacket. As the night crept on, the whispers returned, undeterred by her act of defiance. When her shift ended and the morning sun began to spill weakly through the cracked windows, Carmen rewound the tape and pressed play. At first, all she could hear was the rhythmic thud of her footsteps and the low hum of the building. Then, slowly, the whispers emerged, clearer than ever. Carmen's pulse quickened as she strained to make sense of the words. Watching, waiting, not alone. She dropped the recorder, the sound cutting off abruptly as it hit the concrete floor. The weight of the realization pressed down on her like a vice. Whatever was haunting the warehouse, it was aware of her, watching her, waiting for her. Determined not to be intimidated, Carmen decided to dig deeper. She spent her daylight hours in the town library, poring over old newspapers and forgotten records. It didn't take long for her to uncover the building's grim history. Decades ago, the warehouse had been part of a bustling shipping yard. But a fire, ignited by an electrical fault, had swept through the place late one night, trapping and killing several workers who were on shift. The article mentioned that their bodies had never been properly buried. Instead, they were hastily cremated, and the ashes were said to have been stored somewhere in the warehouse. Carmen's blood ran cold as she read the final line. Locals have long whispered that the spirits of the lost workers still roam the premises, seeking peace that eludes them. Her next shift felt different. The atmosphere was heavier, as if the very walls of the warehouse were suffused with the lingering pain of the past. This time, the whispers seemed more urgent, almost pleading. "Please, help us." The voice that echoed this time was distinct, not a murmur, but a clear, sorrowful cry. Carmen's throat tightened. She knew she had to find where the ashes were hidden. Maybe, just maybe, giving them a proper resting place could end this haunting. The following night, Carmen came prepared. Armed with a stronger flashlight, her recorder, and a packet of sage she'd bought from a nearby spiritual shop, she began her search. The whispers guided her, louder now, like a chorus urging her onward. Every step she took felt heavier, as if the air itself resisted her movements. She turned a corner and felt a sudden chill race down her spine. There, in the shadow of the tallest shelf, lay an old, rusted box, half covered in dust. Carmen's hands shook as she opened it, revealing a pile of gray ash and charred fragments of bone. The sight of the ashes filled Carmen with a mixture of dread and resolve. She could almost hear the whispers intensify, surrounding her in a cacophony of sorrow. Trembling, she pulled the sage from her pocket and lit it, the faint tendrils of smoke curling into the air and wafting around the box. As the smoke drifted, a sudden gust of wind roared through the warehouse, extinguishing her flashlight and plunging the room into darkness. Carmen's heart hammered as she fumbled to relight it. But before she could, an icy hand clamped onto her shoulder. She gasped, whipping around to find no one there. "Help us." The voice was louder now, almost tangible. The shadows around her shifted, forming silhouettes of gaunt, haunted figures. Carmen's breaths came in short, panicked bursts as she realized they were watching her, eyes hollow and imploring. In a voice shaking with fear but resolute, she said, "I'll help you find peace." A moment of silence fell, and then the shadows retreated, leaving only one figure behind. A young man, eyes wide with an expression torn between hope and despair. He pointed to the far wall where an old forgotten memorial plaque stood, tarnished and overlooked. Carmen moved swiftly, using her phone's flashlight to read the plaque. It was dedicated to the victims of the fire, but time had eroded the names, leaving only faint etchings. Tears pricked her eyes as she whispered, "I remember you." She carried the box with the ashes to the memorial and gently set it down, her voice steady as she spoke a prayer for the lost souls. The room seemed to hold its breath. The shadows stilled as the energy shifted. The oppressive chill gave way to a warm, gentle breeze that ruffled her hair and carried away the last of the whispers. For the first time in weeks, the warehouse was silent, peaceful. Carmen stood there until the first rays of dawn crept through the windows, casting a golden light over the forgotten plaque and the ashes that now rested beneath it. The next night, Carmen returned to work, half expecting to feel the familiar dread, but there was nothing. The warehouse, once a prison of echoes and shadows, was now just a quiet building haunted no more. Liam had taken on the job as a night shift security guard at the edge of town, a job nobody seemed to want. It was an old manufacturing plant that had been shut down years ago, left abandoned until rumors of redevelopment started to circulate. The building had a history, a dark one, but that didn't bother him. He needed the money, and his friends joked that nothing could scare him. His first night was mostly uneventful, the only noises being the occasional groan of metal and the wind whistling through broken windows. He set up his station, a dimly lit corner with a cracked table, a small monitor that barely worked, and an ancient phone that looked like it hadn't rung in decades. A radio on the table crackled softly, playing an old country tune that lulled him into a false sense of calm. But then, just as the clock struck midnight, the old phone let out a shrill ring that cut through the silence like a knife. Liam jumped, nearly knocking over his thermos. Heart pounding, he reached for the receiver, half expecting it to be a prank call. "Hello?" His voice echoed in the large empty space. A pause. Then a faint sound came through. a whisper that made his skin crawl. "Help me." The line went dead before Liam could respond. He set the phone down with a shaky hand, glancing around the room as if expecting someone to be watching him from the shadows. But the plant was silent once more. Liam sat there for a moment, listening to the static on the phone line, his mind racing. Who could have called? The building was far from the nearest residential area, and the phone hadn't been in use for years. Maybe it was just a malfunction, an eerie coincidence. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He tried to refocus on his duties, pacing slowly through the dimly lit hallways, shining his flashlight into corners where the shadows seemed unnaturally deep. He was used to working alone, but tonight felt different. The silence was too thick, the air too heavy. As he walked, he heard something, a soft scuffling sound coming from one of the offices. Liam froze, his breath catching in his throat. He turned, training his flashlight on the darkened office. Nothing. He stepped closer, his boots scraping against the concrete floor. As he approached the door, he could hear it again, this time clearer, like something was dragging itself across the floor. "Hello?" His voice cracked as he called out, his flashlight illuminating the interior of the office. There was nothing in sight, but Liam couldn't shake the sense of being watched. He stepped into the office, scanning every corner. A broken window allowed the wind to carry in the smell of rot and decay. His flashlight flickered for a moment, casting odd shadows on the walls. Then, in the farthest corner of the room, he saw it. A dark figure huddled on the floor, its back to him. "Who's there?" Liam asked, his voice trembling. The figure didn't move. He approached slowly, his feet now heavier, as though the air itself was thickening with every step. When he was just a few feet away, the figure slowly turned to face him. Liam's blood ran cold. The thing that faced him was not human. It had hollow black eyes that seemed to swallow the light around them, and its skin was pale, almost as if it had never seen the sun. Its mouth opened in a slow, unnatural smile, revealing jagged teeth that weren't meant for any living creature. Its voice was a raspy whisper, barely audible. "Help me." Liam stumbled backward, panic overtaking him. His heart pounded in his chest as he turned to flee, but the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash. He was trapped. The thing in the office seemed to be moving toward him, its crawling limbs dragging across the floor in a way that no human body should be able to. Liam's mind raced. The exit. He needed to get to the exit. He bolted toward the nearest door, his heart hammering in his ears. But as he reached for the handle, a chill swept through the air, and a voice that was now more than a whisper, echoed through the building. "You shouldn't have come." It was the same voice from the phone, but now it was coming from everywhere, all at once. The walls, the floor, the ceiling. Liam's legs turned to jelly, his hand shaking as he grasped the handle. With a burst of adrenaline, he yanked the door open and ran, not looking back. The hallway stretched on forever, and he could hear the dragging sound growing louder, closer. The thing was following him. He could hear its breath, ragged and wet, as it inched closer with every step. His pulse thundered in his ears, but he didn't dare stop. He rounded a corner, his feet slipping on the damp floor. And then he saw it, the exit sign glowing faintly in the distance. The door. He was almost there. Just as he reached it, he heard the scuttling behind him. Without looking, he shoved the door open and stumbled into the cold night air, gasping for breath. The world outside felt too bright, too real compared to the nightmare he had just escaped. He slammed the door shut behind him and collapsed onto the cold, hard pavement. But when he looked up, his breath catching in his throat, the building was silent again. The windows were dark, and there was no sign of the thing he had seen. He could barely believe it, the adrenaline still pumping through his veins. Liam never returned to the plant. The police found no evidence of what happened that night, and the building was eventually torn down. But Liam couldn't shake the image of the thing in that office, the hollow eyes, the smile. And sometimes late at night when he picks up the phone, he swears he hears the faintest whisper in the receiver, just before it goes silent again. "Help me." Liam couldn't escape the feeling of dread that had settled deep within his bones. The haunting whispers, the cold stare of that thing. It was always with him now. He tried to go on with his life, returning to his routine, working mundane jobs in other cities, but the nightmares would always follow him. The image of that office, the thing in the corner, and its twisted smile haunted his every waking moment. But it wasn't just the nightmares. It was the strange occurrences that began to plague him. One night, as he was driving back to his apartment after a late shift, his phone rang. He hesitated, already knowing who it was, but against his better judgment, he answered. "Hello?" A long pause on the other end of the line, and then came the familiar voice, low, raspy, and filled with malice. "You shouldn't have left." The line went dead before Liam could respond, the sound of static filling his ears. He threw the phone down, his hands trembling. How was it possible? He had left that place, left the horrors of the plant behind. And yet, somehow, they had followed him. From that night on, the whispers became a constant companion. No matter where Liam went, no matter how far he ran, he could hear them. At first it was faint, just a distant murmur in the back of his mind. But over time, it grew louder, more insistent. "You shouldn't have left." He would hear it in the middle of the night, when the air was thick with silence, when the shadows seemed to stretch endlessly across his room. Sometimes it would sound like the thing in the office, other times like the cold, raspy voice of someone trying to get through to him from beyond the grave. Liam stopped sleeping, too afraid to close his eyes, afraid of what he might see when he did. The walls of his apartment began to close in on him, the floorboards creaking with every step, the shadows lurking in the corners like dark, watchful eyes. He tried to drown out the voices by staying awake, by keeping busy, but they were always there, persistent, suffocating, reminding him of the night he thought he'd left behind. One evening, unable to bear it any longer, he drove back to the old plant. It stood there as silent and empty as he had left it, its rusted gates hanging open, the building looming in the distance like some monstrous creature waiting for its next victim. Liam parked in the lot, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Maybe some sort of closure, or perhaps deep down, he had hoped that by facing it again, he could finally rid himself of the lingering terror that had plagued him for so long. He stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath his boots as he walked toward the building. The wind howled through the empty lot, carrying with it the scent of decay, like the very walls of the building were rotting from the inside out. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the familiar cold air hitting him like a slap in the face. His flashlight flickered as he walked down the hallways, and the silence seemed to press in on him from every direction. He had to fight the urge to turn and run, but he forced himself to keep going. He reached the office, the same one where he had encountered the thing all those months ago. It was just as he remembered it, the broken window, the strange smell of rot still lingering in the air. His heart raced as he stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath his weight. And then he heard it, the sound of dragging feet. Liam's blood ran cold. He slowly turned, his flashlight trembling in his hand. There, in the farthest corner of the room, was the thing, its pale, sickly skin glowing in the dim light, its hollow eyes staring straight at him. It grinned, that twisted, jagged grin, and the voice, low and haunting, whispered through the darkness. "You shouldn't have come back." Liam's knees buckled as the terror flooded him. His vision blurred as the thing began to move toward him, dragging its mangled limbs across the floor. But as it got closer, something else began to happen. The room seemed to shift, like the walls themselves were closing in. The air grew thick and the shadows stretched longer, darker. Liam screamed, but no sound came out. His throat closed up, his legs too weak to move. The thing reached out for him, its fingers long and skeletal, as if it had waited for this moment for eternity. And then, in an instant, Everything went black. When Liam woke up, he found himself lying in the same hallway where he had collapsed, his body stiff and bruised. He couldn't remember how he had gotten there, or how long he had been unconscious. But he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't stay here any longer. He stumbled to his feet, his mind foggy and disoriented. But when he looked around, the building was no longer the same. The once familiar hallways now seemed even more twisted, as if the walls themselves had begun to warp and bend, like the building was alive, hungry and waiting for him to make a mistake. Liam knew that the thing would never let him go, that the whispers, the shadows, and the thing itself would follow him forever. There was no escaping it now. And so, with the last shred of his sanity slipping away, Liam ran, knowing deep down that this nightmare would never end. As the building disappeared behind him, the whispers echoed in his ears one last time, their final warning clear and cold: "You shouldn't have come back." And with that, Liam vanished into the night, lost forever to the horrors that haunted him, the ghosts of a nightmare he could never outrun. The third story takes place in a small town hospital, tucked away in a quiet corner of the world. It was a modest facility, with only a handful of patients at any given time. But on the night shift, it became a place of endless horror for anyone who had to work there. Sophia had been working as a night nurse at the hospital for nearly a year. She had grown accustomed to the eerie quietness of the late hours. The hospital's usual bustling energy was replaced by a sense of calm that sometimes felt oppressive. The halls, once filled with the hum of machines and the soft shuffle of footsteps, seemed to become hollow during the night shift. It was the kind of job that required someone who didn't scare easily. Sophia had been working at the hospital's emergency room, where the hours were long, and the patients could be anything from a simple sprain to someone in critical condition. But what made the night shift different, what made it horrifying, were the things she would hear, the things she would see, things that made her question her own sanity. One night, as the clock struck midnight, Sophia found herself in the hospital's dimly lit hallways, walking between the rooms of sleeping patients. The lights flickered overhead, casting long, ominous shadows that danced along the walls. The sounds of the machines beeped softly in the distance, the occasional murmur of voices in the empty hallways adding to the already unnerving atmosphere. As she passed room 303, she heard a soft scraping noise. It was subtle, like someone dragging something heavy across the floor, but it was unmistakable. It sounded as though it was coming from within the room itself. Sophia stopped in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. Room 303 had been empty for days. The patient who had been there, a middle-aged man suffering from a heart attack, had passed away earlier in the week. The room should have been quiet, yet the sound persisted. Curiosity piqued, Sophia slowly pushed the door open. Inside, the room appeared just as she had left it earlier in the day, the bed empty, the blinds drawn. However, it was the corner of the room that caught her attention. There, nestled in the shadow, was an object that hadn't been there before. It looked like a bundle of sheets, or was it? As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, Sophia realized it was not sheets at all. It was a body wrapped in the same white linens that covered the hospital beds. But this one was distinctly different. The body didn't seem like it was resting. It was moving. Sophia's heart stopped. The bundle twitched, slowly at first, and then began to thrash about violently. The sound of it scraping against the floor grew louder, more frantic, until the bundle rolled itself over and fell to the ground with a sickening thud. Sophia screamed and backed away, her heart racing in her chest. The figure in the bundle lifted its head and revealed its face. The eyes, wide and bloodshot, stared directly at her. The man who had died days earlier, whose body was supposed to be in the morgue, was now sitting up, his neck twisted at an unnatural angle. His mouth hung open, emitting a low, guttural sound that sent chills down her spine. Sophia couldn't move, couldn't scream again. She watched in frozen horror as the man slowly lifted himself from the ground, his limbs jerking and twitching as if they no longer obeyed him. His skin was pale, nearly translucent, and his fingers twitched as if seeking something. His eyes never left her. In a frantic panic, Sophia turned to run, but just as she reached the door, the lights flickered violently, casting the room into complete darkness. She felt a cold breath on the back of her neck, and the hair on her arms stood on end. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, and she could see the figure standing right behind her. The man's face was inches away from hers, his eyes wide, his mouth contorted into a grotesque grin. His breath smelled like decay, his skin clammy and cold as he reached out toward her. She screamed, stumbling backward into the hallway. But the man, no, the thing, followed her, dragging itself along the floor with unnatural speed. The sounds of its movements echoed down the empty hallway, growing louder, closer. Sophia ran, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't escape. The hospital was an old building with narrow, winding corridors, each one leading deeper into the building's belly. But she had to try. She reached the nurse's station and grabbed the phone, dialing for help, but the line was dead. The lights above her flickered again, this time accompanied by a deep, guttural growl that vibrated through the walls. Turning, she saw it. The thing was there, its twisted form standing at the end of the hallway. Its pale, lifeless eyes glowed with an eerie light as it moved toward her with a slow, deliberate pace. It wasn't just a man anymore. It was something else, something much darker. Sophia turned and ran, her feet pounding against the floor as she tried to put as much distance between herself and that thing as she could. She could hear it dragging itself behind her, closer with every step. Her lungs burned, her breath ragged as she pushed herself harder, faster. She didn't know how long she ran. She didn't know how many turns she took, but when she finally came to a stop, gasping for air, she found herself standing in front of the morgue. Without thinking, she burst inside, slamming the door shut behind her. Her heart was racing, her mind spinning as she turned to face the empty room. But something wasn't right. The morgue's shelves were open, the bodies missing. There was no one here, no sound except for her ragged breathing. And then, the scraping began again. It was the same sound, only this time it was coming from inside the morgue. She slowly turned, her blood turning to ice as the sound grew louder, closer. There, in the corner of the room, a body began to shift. The same man, the one who had died, rose slowly from the cold steel table, his body jerking and twitching violently, his eyes still wide open, staring straight at her. It wasn't the hospital that had changed. It wasn't the building. It was her. Sophia's sanity unraveled as the room spun around her. The creature that had been a man now walked toward her with stiff mechanical movements. His mouth opened, but it wasn't words that came out. It was a low, inhuman growl, one that sent waves of terror flooding over her. And then, as if everything in her mind had shattered, the creature lunged, grabbing her by the shoulders with an inhuman strength. The last thing Sophia saw before the world went dark was that twisted grin and the unblinking eyes of the thing that had once been a man. The world was cold and dark, and time seemed to stretch out for what felt like an eternity. Sophia's heart pounded erratically in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her body was paralyzed, as if the weight of the terror had drained all her strength. The creature's grip on her shoulders was like iron, unyielding and suffocating. But then, everything stopped. The creature's grip loosened, and the low growl that had haunted her ears faded. Sophia blinked, her vision blurry, her mind disoriented, her eyes slowly focused. And for a brief moment she thought she might have imagined it all. But no, it wasn't a hallucination. The morgue was just as cold, just as empty, and the body of the man, the thing, was still there, standing in front of her. But now, it was still. Too still. Sophia dared not move, not even to breathe. Her chest was tight, her entire being caught in the aftermath of sheer terror. The room seemed to shrink around her, suffocating her. The silence was deafening, stretching on far too long. She could feel her pulse in her throat, every heartbeat a sharp reminder that she was still alive. that she could still escape. But escape to what? The hospital had become a nightmare she couldn't wake from. The walls, the halls, the rooms, everything was twisted, a never-ending labyrinth that would close in on her no matter how far she ran. Sophia was trapped, and there was no way out. The thing that had once been a man, the man who had died on the table, stood motionless, his head tilted at an odd angle, as if waiting for her to make the next move. But no matter how she tried to steady her breathing, her legs refused to move. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body betrayed her. She couldn't escape. The silence broke. The thing's eyes, those wide, dead eyes, shifted. It blinked, the motion jerky, unnatural. And then, with a sudden lurch, it moved toward her again, its body swaying as if it was fighting against its own motions. It let out a low, almost gurgling sound that vibrated through the room. Sophia's heart froze. The figure reached out with one bony hand, its fingers twitching as though it were trying to grasp something. She could see it clearly now. Its skin was mottled, pale, and translucent, hanging loosely over its bones. It wasn't human anymore. It was something worse, something beyond understanding. The air grew thick, heavy with the smell of decay. The temperature dropped, the frost of death creeping into her skin. The thing's grip, when it finally made contact with her, was cold and clammy. But worse than that was the feeling that washed over her, a feeling of inevitability. Like this was all part of some cursed plan and she was just another piece of it. Sophia gasped, her eyes wide with terror. She wanted to scream, but the sound was trapped in her throat. The creature drew her closer, its eyes fixed on hers as though it could see right through her. Its breath was ragged, hollow, and she could feel its cold air seeping into her lungs, choking her. Carmen had taken the job at the old shipping warehouse to help pay her college tuition. It was an enormous, drafty place on the edge of town, surrounded by overgrown fields and remnants of railroad tracks that hadn't seen use in decades. The building stood like a relic of a forgotten era, with its tall, rust-streaked metal walls and cracked windows. During the day, the place was a hum of activity with workers loading and unloading freight. But at night, Carmen was the only one there. She was the night shift guard, tasked with keeping watch from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Her first few nights were quiet, almost too quiet. The only sounds she heard were the distant hum of the highway and the occasional groan of the warehouse settling as the cool night air pressed in. But on her fourth night, things took a strange turn. As she made her routine round, in a final act of desperation, Sophia summoned every ounce of strength she could muster. With a cry of fear and determination, she shoved the creature away. It stumbled back, its legs contorting in an unnatural way as it fell to the floor. For a brief moment, Sophia felt a glimmer of hope. She could escape. She could... And then the lights flickered. The room seemed to collapse into darkness, the shadows swallowing everything around her. The walls stretched and distorted, growing larger and smaller, twisting and turning as though they were alive. The cold intensified, biting at her skin, the very air around her growing suffocating. Sophia stumbled, disoriented, her mind reeling from the terror she had witnessed. The thing, whatever it was gone. But the sense of dread, the oppressive presence that had filled the room, remained. For what felt like an eternity, Sophia stood there, frozen in place, her thoughts swirling. She didn't know what was real anymore. She didn't know if she was still alive or trapped in some twisted version of hell. The world had changed, and there was no going back. But then something shifted. She felt a pull, a tug at the very core of her being. It wasn't just the fear or the terror that still clung to her skin. It was something deeper, something darker. The thing wasn't gone. It was still here, lurking in the shadows, watching her. Sophia took a tentative step forward, her legs shaking beneath her. She had no choice but to move. She had to escape, had to survive, no matter what it took. The halls of the hospital seemed endless, the rooms all blurring together, as if the entire building had become one giant maze. The flickering lights guided her steps, but they offered no comfort, only more darkness. As she passed room after room, she felt the weight of something watching her. The creature was out there somewhere in the shadows, stalking her every move. She didn't know if it was real or if she had finally lost her mind. But what she did know was that she couldn't stop. Not now, not ever. The emergency exit door was just ahead, a glimmer of light in the darkness. But when she reached for the handle, the door wouldn't open. It was locked. Her heart raced in panic, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. She turned, her eyes frantically searching for another way out, but the hallway was empty, silent. And then she heard it. A soft scraping noise just behind her. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable. The thing had found her. Sophia turned slowly, her body trembling with fear. There, at the end of the hallway, was the figure. It was waiting for her, its eyes locked on hers with that same unblinking stare. The lights above her flickered one last time, and she could feel the weight of the creature's gaze bearing down on her. It wasn't the hospital that had changed. It wasn't the walls, the lights, or the rooms. It was her. She was the one trapped in this nightmare, and there was no way out. She was part of it now, a part of whatever darkness had taken hold of this place. As the creature closed in, its cold, clammy hands reaching for her, Sophia realized with horror that she would never escape. The night shift had claimed her, and there would be no dawn, no rescue. The last thing Sophia saw before the darkness swallowed her was the creature's twisted face, its eyes filled with endless hunger. And then, everything went silent.